Oh, hi there. I'm just trying to make a video on something that I'm trying to learn about. I was interested in necessary and sufficient reason, so I've put this thing together to try and teach myself how it all works. Okay, so let me see. I've did this thing as a series of diagrams. I worked out some diagrams that could be of use or help to someone when learning about this thing. Right, so I've got four-sided objects, and they go from being as random as possible to being as regular as possible, or as perfect as possible. So we've got a quadrilateral, a rectangle and a square, and a quadrilateral has angles and sides of different lengths and angles of different sizes. So that's irregular. A rectangle is more ordered and a square is more ordered again. So I thought, can I teach myself about necessary and sufficient reason with these? And so what I did was, first of all, I saw I did these three simple diagrams. If something's quadrilateral, it's necessary for something to be quadrilateral in order to be a rectangle. But if something's a rectangle, then we don't need to know anything more about it. We have sufficient knowledge of that thing to tell us that it is also a quadrilateral. If we look at a rectangle, it is necessary for something to be a rectangle in order for it to be a square. Whereas if we know something's a square, we have sufficient information to tell us that it is also a rectangle. And if something is a quadrilateral, it is necessary that something is a quadrilateral in order to be a square. But if something's a square, we have sufficient information. We don't need to know anything more about that thing, if we know it's a square, to also know that it's a quadrilateral. So I thought, right, let's try and work it out as a diagram so make it easier to remember. And so what I did was I put it together as a Venn diagram, like this, and it's a sort of Venn diagram with areas where there's one area inside another. So look, here we go. I've done a red dashed line here to show an outer area, and within that outer area, everything within that is a quadrilateral. And I've got another dashed line here, and that demarks another area, and everything within that area is a rectangle. And then I've got another dashed line right in the middle showing squares. Everything within that dashed line is a square. And so let's see how the necessary and sufficient reasons go. I've drawn the same diagram, but here it's a bit clearer. You see here I've drawn all little diamonds and kite-shaped things to show quadrilaterals. I've shown the rectangles here in the middle bit, and then I've shown the squares right in the middle. Well, here I've just redrawn that diagram but just made it a bit clearer, showing the paths of necessary and sufficient reason. And we'll see that a pattern emerges. The necessary reasons flow from the periphery to the centre, whereas the sufficient reasons flow from the centre to the periphery. Let's go through it and it'll be really clear and simple when I start going through it. So, quadrilaterals. It is necessary for something to be a quadrilateral in order to be a rectangle, so the necessary reason points towards the centre. It is necessary for something to be a quadrilateral in order to be a square. The path is to the centre. It is necessary for something to be a rectangle in order to be a square. And the same sufficient reasons go from the centre to the periphery. So if something's a rectangle, then we have sufficient information. We don't need to know anything more about it to know it's also a quadrilateral. If something's a square, we have sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also a rectangle. If something's a square, we have sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also a quadrilateral. So the sufficient reasons flow from the centre to the periphery, whereas the necessary reasons flow from the periphery to the centre. And so I thought, okay, well, that's okay. I seem to get that so far. Now I'm going to try and do the same thing, but substitute in something else. So what I did was I substituted in this. I thought, well, what if instead of quadrilaterals we say matter or elements, or all physical stuff? And what if instead of rectangles we talked about animals? So there's a picture of a bird and a picture of a dog and a picture of a fish. I'm not very good at drawing, you probably guessed that by now. And then instead of a square we can talk about humans. And so instead of quadrilaterals, rectangles and squares, we talk about matter, animals and humans. Now I wonder if the same Venn diagram would work. Okay, so here we go, here's another Venn diagram. And so there we go. There is matter, animals and humans. So here, matter or elements or physical stuff, whatever you want to call it. And so I've just done lots of dots. That's everything within that area is all of the matter in the universe. And there's another dashed line here. And everything within that dashed line is all the animals in the universe or in the world. And then here's another dashed line. And within that area are all the humans in the world. So here was animals. I've done little dogs and a spider and a cat and a bird and another spider and a couple of fish. And here in the middle we've got some stick humans. Figurative art is not my forte. And so let's see if the same necessary and sufficient reasons stack up. So here is exactly the same Venn diagram, but what I've done is I've taken off all the drawings that clutter that one up, and this is a bit clearer. So let's look at the necessary and sufficient reasons. Okay, matter, animals, humans. Right, let's go for the necessary ones. If something is matter, it is necessary for something to be matter in order for it to be animal. It is necessary for something to be matter in order for it to be human. It's necessary for something to be animal in order for it to be human. So the necessary reasons also flow from the periphery to the centre. Now we look at the sufficient reasons. If we know something is an animal, we have sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also matter. If something is human, we have sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also matter. If something is human, we have sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also animal. So the sufficient reasons also flow from the centre to the periphery. So that diagram of matter, animals and humans, and that diagram of quadrilaterals, rectangles and squares is basically the same diagram. And so the same things work if you substitute them in, that the same flow happens, with the necessary reasons flowing to the centre and the sufficient reasons flowing to the periphery. Okay, so then I couldn't resist doing something a bit mischievous, and I thought, well, let's just try and plonk God onto this diagram and just see what happens. Okay, so we know that matter exists. We know that animals exist, and we know that humans exist, but we're not quite sure whether God exists. So if we were going to put God here, it would have to either go at the centre or at the periphery. No one out there thinks to themselves, oh yeah, God is sort of halfway between animals and matter, or God is halfway between animals and humans. No, God, if God is going to go on this diagram, it's got to go either right in the middle or right at the outside, encompassing everything. Okay, and so this is just for out of amateur interest. I'm not particularly clever or anything like that, or I'm just sort of having a look here. And so here we go. Here's one diagram with God is right at the middle, and there's matter, animals, humans, God, and then there's another one I've done here showing God, matter, animals and humans. And so I'm going to go through both of these in turn, and I'm not going to prove whether God exists. What I am going to look at is, if God exists, what sort of characteristics does it have, or do they have? Okay, so let's run through the necessary reasons and see what they tell us about this thing I've got in the middle of this diagram. Right, necessary reasons. It is necessary for something to be human in order for it to be God. It's necessary for something to be matter in order for it to be God. It is necessary for something to be animal in order for it to be God. Okay, so sufficient reasons. If we know something is God, there is sufficient information to tell us that it is also human. If something is God, there is sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also matter. If something is God, there is sufficient information to tell us that thing is also animal. Now, if you subscribe to the Abrahamic religions, if you're a Christian or Muslim or a Jew, you're probably scratching your head and you're thinking that is not a description of the sort of thing I pray to. That's not the sort of thing that I believe in. So, what sort of thing is that? And there's a couple of things that could be of interest. that is more of a description of, well, there were several things that I thought could sort of conceivably meet that description. Now, if you look at the Egyptian gods like the Sphinx or Janus, these are things that are partly human, partly animal, and that they were sort of human in type. The idea was that they lived and breathed, and similar with Greek gods or Roman gods, Zeus, Apollo here, etc. These were human type beings that lived on Mount Olympus, that could mix with us, that could fornicate with us, that could intervene in the lives of men, and so a Greek god or a Roman god, that would be a description of this sort of thing that we're looking at here. Another thing that would fit that description would be Marvel superheroes like Hulk or Superman, things that are human, living, breathing animals, but that just have extra powers, sort of powers that normal human beings don't have. Another thing that would match the description would be pagan gods like the Green Man or Sheila the Gig, or these sort of weird druid sort of things that some people believe in. The Nietzschean Superman could possibly fit that description. Someone like Shakespeare, Kant, Usain Bolt, Muhammad Ali, Homer, someone, someone that is human but who has extra abilities beyond the normal range that normal people don't have, someone that is exceptional, or a very, very exceptional type of human being. Jesus could conceivably fit that description, but God couldn't, obviously. But and so, yeah, that's interesting. And also someone like the Dalai Lama, something like that, a person that some people revere as a deity, but who is essentially a human. So the thing with this is it's finite. It's a temporary living, breathing animal type thing. It lives, it breathes, it's an animal, and it can love. Okay, so that it has a brain, it has a consciousness, and so, but then again, it falls down in terms of being a sort of thing, God of the Abrahamic texts, because it's not omnipotent, it's not an infinite being. If this exists, then where is it? Presumably it would have to be somewhere within Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so let's set that to one side and look at the other example. Okay, so now this one. Now, what sort of thing is that? Let's work through the necessary and sufficient reasons and see what's happening here. Right, necessary. If something is God, it is necessary for something to be God in order for it to be matter. It is necessary for something to be God in order for it to be animal. It is necessary for something to be God in order for it to be human. So those are the necessary reasons, going to the centre. Right, let's look at the sufficient reasons. If something is matter, that is sufficient information to tell us that it is also God. If something is human, that is sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also God. If something is animal, that is sufficient information to tell us that that thing is also God. Okay, so what sort of thing is this then? What can we say about it? We don't know if it exists or not. No one does, for sure. But if that exists, then what sort of thing is it? Let's have a look. Okay, so the sort of thing that could fit this description, I've done a few things that could conceivably be, this is sort of Parmenidean or Spinozistic type entity. If you look at the deism of someone like Tom Paine, that is similar-ish. If you look at Leibniz's windowless monads, that wouldn't really work, because Leibniz thought that some monads were dominant and some were less dominant, and so this thing is more inert than matter. We've got sort of a conscious here, and less intelligent, matter totally inert, and then suddenly it's absurd, the idea of consciousness suddenly springing into being as something becomes more inert away from the centre of this diagram. So this thing does tick the box in that it's infinite, but it has no brain or consciousness, and it can't love. Okay, so I've just written a word here. So I've given this thing a name. I've got a noun, and I've called that thing God, but that isn't a very good name for this thing. we could better call it something like existence or energy, nature, everything, or we could call it the universe. Okay, this is an abstract concept of theoretical physics. There is probably no name that could be more misleading or close more minds than calling this thing God, because as soon as you say God, all these other images pop up in people's brains and everyone's minds close and they start foaming at the mouth. So this thing could not be more different than the God of the Abrahamic texts. The God of the Abrahamic text speaks, this one doesn't. The God of the Abrahamic text judges, this one doesn't. The God of the Bible, the Quran, the Old Testament, New Testament has a moral agenda, this one does not. Okay, so what I've done is, these are the two models of what God could be like. So now I've just written some notes here. Right, I haven't proved that God does or does not exist, but I have proved that it is not omnipotent. It can either be a finite temporary animal that can think, or an infinite load of energy that has nothing to do with us and can't think. Right, now obviously if you're a religious person, you won't be impressed with this argument because religious people reject reason as a method. But if you do respect the idea of reason and necessary reason and sufficient reason, if you think they are valid, then I think it's incumbent on you also to reject the Abrahamic idea of God as an omnipotent, infinite consciousness, because that seems to me to be oxymoronic. But so I haven't proved anything for sure. I'm not saying anything for definite either way, but that might be of interest to someone. I'm not particularly clever, or I don't know much about philosophy or anything like that, so if I've made any silly schoolboy errors, please feel free to point them out. I don't want to be wrong any longer than I need to be. But I hope that's of interest in terms of necessary and sufficient reason, and if I've made any silly mistakes or errors of reasoning, please feel free to let me know. I don't pretend to be more clever than I really am. Okay, hope that's of interest. Bye-bye. Bye.